In this class, we're going to look at HTML and cascading style sheets. We're going to take a look at the formatting capabilities of cascading style sheets and run through a quick example so that you can see how style sheets, when used together with properly structured HTML, can create a web page that looks nice. I'm going to expand upon the code sample that we used in the previous lesson. My code sample is on my desktop and it's called index.html. I'm going to open up my file in my HTML editor, in this case TextEdit on the PC notepad. I'm going to click and drag the index.html icon onto the TextEdit icon. Expand my window so I have a little bit more space to work with. And now I'm going to add a little bit of style to this page. If you preview this web page in a web browser by double-clicking on the file, you'll see that the page is black and white. It's a little bland. It's a great start, but we want to breathe a little bit of life into this file. Style sheets are the tool that we'll use to add life to the structure that we define in HTML. I'm going to close my browser window for a moment and switch back over to TextEdit. Earlier we learned that the head element in our source code is where we'll put items that are necessary for our page to look and function right, but are not necessarily viewed by the viewer. This is where we're going to put our style sheet references. As you might expect, the tags that we'll use to create this style element are style and a closing style tag. I'm going to put each of these tags on its own line and add a bit of space between them. I'm creating that space using the return key on my keyboard and the tab key. I'm doing this because I'm now going to create rules which define the way that my HTML tags should behave. What does behave mean? Behave means how my web browser will display my page. Before I define those rules, I'm going to add one more piece to my opening style tag. This is a little different than the tags that we've created before, and that piece is called an attribute. We're going to cover attributes and HTML and style sheets in great detail in future lessons. This is going to be a quick example of how everything works together to give you a sense of where we're going. What I'd like to do is I'd like to define some basic rules that govern how the body tag should be presented by my web browser. But before I can do that, I need to add an attribute to the opening style tag, and that attribute is type equals open quote text / CSS. We're going to review CSS attributes in great detail in future lessons, but for right now, this format, type equals open quote text / CSS, contained within my opening style tag, is necessary to get started. Now that I've set up my opening and closing tags for my style element, I'll create my rules. I'm going to set up my rules to govern how the body tag and the paragraph tag function. To define these rules, I need to specify what's referred to as a selector. In this case, that selector will be body. And to give myself a place to put my rules, I'm going to define that space with an open curly bracket and a closing curly bracket. Now I'm set up to create a rule that'll govern how the body tag is displayed. Within the opening and closing curly brackets, for the body tag selector, I'm going to define a property and a value. There are hundreds of tags available to you in cascading style sheets. We'll take a look at a few of the easy ones. To get started, we'll set a background color for this page. The property which governs how the background color should be displayed is background color, colon, and the hexadecimal value for white, which in this case is pound FFFFFF. And I close this rule with a semicolon. Now I'm going to add a few more rules to govern how the body tag should be displayed. I'll hit the return key on my keyboard, tab over 4 times so that my next rule lines up with my first rule, and I'm going to add a little bit of margin on the left, and then another rule to add some margin on the right. The syntax for this property is margin dash left colon, and in this case I'll assign 20% on the left, hit return, tab over 4 times so that my next line lines up, and add some margin on the right, 20% again. I'll also add a border around the perimeter of the body tag. I'll hit the return key, tab over 4 times, type border for the border property, and specify a border that's 1 pixel in width, that should be a series of dots, and gray. And the hexadecimal value for gray is CC, CC, CC. There are many shades of gray, we're just using an easy one. Hit return, tab over 4 times. I'll also add a little bit of padding within my body tag. I'll type padding property, and I'll specify 10 pixels. And lastly for this rule, I'll specify the font that should be used. In this case, the property is font-family, and we'll type sans serif to use the default sans serif font on your computer. Now I'm going to save my work under the File menu and specify Save, Save As if you're creating this file for the first time. And I'm going to double-click on index.html to see how it looks in a web browser. Now I can see that this code looks different than it did in the previous example. If I look back at my HTML code, we didn't change anything inside the body tag. We didn't change our paragraph element or the bold or italics text. We didn't change anything about this code, which was necessary to get the content onto our web page. However, now, if I switch back over to my web browser, I can see that this text has moved down a little bit. It's moved over on the left. It's moved over on the right. It has a dotted border around it. And there's a little bit of space in between the left, right, top, and bottom of this boundary around my text. This is an example of style sheets affecting the presentation of my HTML tags. Let's add a few more rules. Let's add a rule to govern how the paragraph tag functions. To set up this rule, I have to specify a selector, in this case, P for the paragraph tag, and define a range in which I can create my rules using the opening and closing curly brackets. Setting that range up, I'll hit the return key a few times to space out the opening and closing curly brackets, and tab over a few times so that I can begin to write my rules. Now again, I'm going to specify a background color. And again, I'm going to specify that background color as white. And I'll add a rule to govern padding for my paragraph tag. But for right now, I'll leave that value as 0. Now because our body tag has the default color of white, we're not going to see the background color on the paragraph tag as white right now. But you might be beginning to think the same thing that I am. The reason I'm creating these rules to govern how the body tag looks and how the paragraph tag look are so that I have the option at any time to change those colors without having to change my HTML code itself. Speaking of the HTML code, let's add one more tag to our HTML code so that we can create another rule to govern its presentation. Let's add a heading to our HTML. A heading is essentially a title, and smaller headings become subtitles. The H1 tag is the default largest size of a heading in HTML. So I'll create an opening H1 tag and a closing H1 tag. And between those two tags, I'll add a title. In this case, I'll type, "Hello World," just like the title we have displayed at the top of our web browser. And I'll clean up my source code up here at the top, taking out an extra space in my paragraph rule. And I'll add a rule to govern the presentation of my H1 tag. Using the same syntax as we did when we created our rules for the body and paragraph tags. And for right now, I'll specify a color for the text contained within my H1 element using the color property in CSS, and I'll set that value to black, which in hexadecimal is 000000. Now if I save my work and switch over to my web browser and refresh using the Reload Current Page button, I can see a heading is now displayed on my page that reads "Hello World" before the text of my page and the formatting around that text. And depending on what browser you chose to preview in, this may display a little differently. We'll talk more later about how to address this, but for now, we can see we have our text formatted as we defined in our HTML file. Now if I switch back over to my source code, I can now change my CSS rules so that the web page that you see in your web browser looks better than just plain black and white. Because we used standard HTML tags and defined rules that would affect those tags, specifying them as selectors in our CSS rules, we can change the presentation of our page without having to recode our entire page. If we come back and take a look at the rules that we set up that govern how the body tag is presented, we can breathe a little bit of life into this page. Now, if this was a real web page on a real website, and it was early March, and you wanted to change the presentation of your website in preparation for a holiday, like St. Patrick's Day, you might want to make your web page green and white and orange. We could accomplish this using style sheets by changing the background color property. If I delete the hexadecimal value for white that I typed in earlier and type in a green hexadecimal value, in this example 9DFFAF, and save my file and switch back over to my web browser and hit refresh, now the page changes. It's not finished, but I didn't have to come in to my HTML, jump down, find the body tag, and change the presentation of the body tag in line inside my code. You might be wondering, where do these hexadecimal values come from? That looks foreign. That doesn't look like any value of color I've ever seen before. Most robust graphics editing programs have a capability to provide you with hexadecimal colors. In this case, I used Adobe Photoshop to quickly go in and find out what the hexadecimal value for green was. Before this lesson, that's how I knew 9DFFAF would give me a shade of green. But now I also want to adjust the space on either side of my page to take up less margin. So I'll reduce the margin on the left and the right from 20 to 10. Also, I'll change the color of my H1 tag to be orange, and I'll do that using F4A60E. Now if I save my file and switch over to my browser and refresh, I can see the page changes again. And I'm going to make one more modification. I'd like the text contained within my paragraph tag to have a little bit of space. I don't want the characters right up against the edge of my paragraph boundary, which is defined by this white space, which we defined earlier inside our paragraph rule as white. And I'll add a bit of padding. Right now I have 0 pixels specified. I'll add 10 pixels of padding and save my file and switch back over to my browser and refresh, and see a little bit of space added around the interior of the space defined by my paragraph tag. This process of tweaking in our HTML editor, switching over to the web browser, refreshing to see the most current version of our file, and tweak and edit and tweak and edit is very common and is something that you will do continuously.